Hi everybody, welcome to the DRF Breeding Report. I'm Dan Illman. Last week, Daily Racing Form was proud to introduce the new Beyer, Sire performance standings. And here to help me discuss the new data is my co-host for this segment, Nicole Russo. And Nicole, I thought the data was fascinating in perhaps finding value stallions and really analyzing leading stallions not only from a breeding standpoint, but from a handicapping viewpoint as well.
Great, Dan. We're really excited to unveil this data on a number of levels. As you mentioned, it's going to provide breeders with a new metric to analyze the progeny performance of stallions using our exclusive Beyer speed figures, perhaps able to uncover some value sires who maybe aren't making headlines but are siring a high percentage of high-quality runners. It's also hopefully going to be a very, very useful tool for handicappers as well, looking at performance patterns from stallions' progeny by buyers, especially with some up-and-coming 2-year-old and freshman sires where you're just sort of starting to see the data from those runners.
There is so much data, and it's all available for download at drf.com/Beyer Sire. It really is an intriguing tool, and you can break it down by various surfaces and distances. You can have turf horses, you can have sprinters, you can have 2-year-olds, you can have first crop sires. But from a compare and contrast standpoint, let's look at the traditional way that the breeding industry ranks the leading sires, and it's by earnings. And Tappet is the king of the mountain for the 3rd straight year. In 2016, he was the leading sire by total earnings over Curlin, Uncle Mo, Candy Ride, and Kitten's Joy. These earnings can always be a little bit misleading, these rankings, simply because one race like the Delta Jackpot, for example, and we'll talk about that in more depth when discussing the leading first crop stallions by earnings in 2016, they can skew these earnings somewhat. Lucky Pulpit, I believe, who finished 6th in the leading earnings category for all stallions in 2016, well, he was carried by California Chrome.
Right. Of course, you hit the nail on the head there with the $10 million Dubai World Cup, which was then the world's richest race, is, of course, going to have such a major impact on the earnings list. This year, things are really stepping up with, the 12 million Pegasus World Cup coming up this weekend. You've got the Dubai World Cup. You've got the Breeders' Cup Classic at the end of the year. You have a number of high-priced races for 2- and 3-year-olds. Of course, the horses who are winning those races, quality horses, quality stallions. No one would argue with the quality of a horse like Tappet, but earnings are just sort of one piece of the puzzle when you're evaluating a stallion because of so many competing factors.
Well, now let's take a look at the top 5 stallions of 2016 based on the highest percentage of 100 or greater Beyer speed figures and the minimum 150 starters. We see it's a bit of a different list. Yes, Curlin is still on the list. Yes, the great Tappet is still on the list, but we do have a new leader, Medaglia d'Oro, and these standings provide a measurement of a sire's ability to produce fast horses, not necessarily the most winners or highest earnings, and we see some rock-solid stallions like Speightstown on the list. And perhaps a bit of a surprise is how well Flatter has done in producing 100-plus Beyer performers. Flatter is a very good stallion, but he certainly doesn't get the level of press as a Tappet or a Curlin.
Right. Flatter really sort of flies under the radar while doing very well on a number of metrics. When you look at the horses from the APND line who are at stud nowadays, of course, such a great sire line, Flatter is right up there with, say, Bernardini or Malibu Moon in terms of average earnings by runner, in terms of number of stakes winners per crop. Flatter does a lot, but Claiborne Farm, which traditionally has bred smaller books to its stallions than some other major operations, Flatter just sort of doesn't have the numbers to compete on the national scale earnings list. So numbers like these by the Beyer speed figures, looking at the averages and the percentages, this is really where you see sort of a steady performance by a quality stallion. Speightstown also very much fits that mold, just a very steady horse who consistently turns out really high-level runners who maybe flies a little bit under the radar.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, that if breeders are looking for maybe under-the-radar stallions, you would get some honorable mentions on this list, like Lookin' at Lucky or Birdstone. Again, horses that do not have big names or command gigantic stud fees. But when you actually break down the numbers of percentage of high-quality Beyer speed figure performances, they rank up there with the best.
Right. One of the surprising pieces of data that I found going through this data, and there are really so many ways to break it down, as we've mentioned, was that Birdstone really had a sneaky good year by percentages of horses running 90 plus and 100 plus. And Birdstone stands for an advertised fee of only $5,000 this year at Gainesway, which of course also houses Tappet. And he's turning out runners on a comparable level to horses like Awesome Again and Giants Causeway and Tappet himself, who all, of course, stand for much higher fees. So there's one example of the data turning up a very interesting value sire.
Now let's look at another way that perhaps the earnings list can be a bit misleading. Let's take a peek at the top 5 leading first crop sires of 2016. Dialed In leads the list and was the champion stallion by earnings of 2016, defeating out Union Rags and Bodymeister, Tapizar, and Gemologist. But Dialed In's earnings were skewed by Gunnevera's performance in the Delta Jackpot. I mean, that one win in the Rich Race kind of nailed down the championship for him all by itself.
Right, absolutely. And I'm not going to argue that Dialed In is not a very good quality young stallion. I mean, he led this freshman sire list by stakes winners as well. So he certainly wasn't a one-horse wonder. But when you look at how close the earnings title was between him and between Union Rags, there's no question that the Delta Jackpot is what clinched that title for him. And again, so many things go into purse structures, including slots at one track or another, or, what each track has to work with. So earnings really only one metric.
In comparison, here are the top 5 highest percentage of 80-plus Beyer speed figure performers by first crop sire, and it's a bit of a different list. Dialed In is dropped out of the top 5. Bodymeister leads, and we see the Factor as well on there, Union Rags, and then some interesting runners. Algorithms and Dominus produced some high-quality Beyer speed figure performers.
Right. Dominus actually had the highest number of the year for a first crop stallion. It's very interesting to look at this list, and if you're a savvy handicapper who, plays along with bloodlines and pays attention to these things, you can really start turning up kind of good quality horses. Bodymeister, who leads this list by percentages, only third on the earnings list. Well, Bodymeister was a very brilliant, very fast horse who could carry that speed and distance. And you start to look at the Beyers as some of his progeny, and you think, gee, maybe he's imparting them with that brilliance. And if you're a student of pedigree, of course, you know that Bodymeister didn't run at 2, burst onto the scene at 3. You think, gee, perhaps these horses are going to step up as they come into their 3-year-old year even more. And maybe if you're a savvy handicapper, you're looking at Bodymeister, you're looking at the Factor.
I think that's a very good point, because we want to tout this as a possible handicapping tool as well, especially with horses that are doing things for the first time starters, or first time trying the turf, or horses stretching out in ability. You have the option at drf.com/BeyerSire to get the information what stallions are producing early 2-year-old types by percentage of high-quality Beyer speed figures. And we know that there are Beyer pars in the past performances for maiden special or maiden claiming races. And maybe this could be helpful in finding a handicapper finding a stallion that produces horses that can exceed the Beyer. And now all of a sudden we've got pedigrees of first-time starters that you want to include on tickets.
Right. And, and of course, so many kind of hidden things you can turn up. You mentioned turf sires. I mean, perhaps you can turn up, a hidden turf sire when you look at these lists and you say, gee, this horse never ran on turf, but look at his high-quality numbers by Beyer percentages on this turf list. The late Scat Daddy is one great example. He never ran on turf. He turned out to be an outstanding international sire, and that is borne out by these Beyer sire performance standings.
It's really a lot of data, folks, but it's not too daunting. It's a lot of fun once you get your hands in there and get dirty with this data. drf.com/BeyerSire, free downloadable data for the new Beyer Sire performance standings. Check it out. It's a lot of fun, and it might help you with your handicapping.
Beyer figures can be useful to breeders because the way that we measure the success of stallions can be very misleading.
People in the industry have seen this and come to accept the figures as a pretty good guide of horses' quality.
Accurate performance measurement can only be helpful to owners, breeders, trainers, as well as horse players.